I had always thought it was my responsibility to support my family. To make sure my wife, Emily, and our home had all they needed, I put in a lot of overtime, pushed myself to the limit, and gave up my own ambitions. I only ever asked for a small token of gratitude, a kind word, or any recognition that my efforts were valued. However, I discovered the harsh reality that night. My sacrifices were not appreciated, but rather expected. It had been a demanding workday. As I struggled at the front door, I felt the weight of innumerable obligations pressing down on my shoulders. Emily hardly looked at me as she sat on the couch and browsed through her phone. Dinner smelled great, and the house was immaculate, but I had a strange feeling. I was mentally as well as physically worn out. I had grown weary of shouldering the entire burden alone. I sat down next to her and rubbed my temples. I whispered, looking for some sympathy. Today was rough. She sighed without raising her gaze. It is your responsibility to provide, not to whine. I went cold. The words pierced me more deeply than any blade. I looked back at her, trying to find any indication that she wasn't sorry or that she hadn't meant it that way. However, there was nothing, only the faint glimmer of her phone, which illuminated her expression of indifference. I was completely chilled by a creeping awareness that dawned on me. To make sure she got everything, I had been killing myself for years. However, she saw me as a machine, a provider rather than a human. My sacrifices, my hardships, and my weariness were all inconsequential. My only responsibility was to continue giving and working. Something broke inside of me. The change was not violent or furious, but rather it was silent and determined. What would happen if I stopped providing if I was only a provider? Without saying another word, I got up and made my way to the bedroom, my thoughts racing. This sentence broke something deep inside me, and it could never be repaired. I began to doubt everything for the first time, including my value, my role, and most importantly, the basis of my marriage. I would step away from that role if she simply saw me as a provider. I will no longer compromise on anything. I will no longer sacrifice myself for someone who only considered my efforts to be a duty. I woke up the following morning with clarity, something I hadn't experienced in years. I wasn't looking back this time, and the change was on the way. If all I was to her was a provider, I would see what would happen if I stopped prioritizing that position. I did it to restore my own sense of value, not because I was angry or to punish her. I began modestly. She remarked at breakfast that she and her friends were going to have a spa day, which is one of her frequent indulgences that I had always paid for, without question. I just answered, "I'm sure you'll figure something out," rather than my typical immediate response, "Sure, take my card." Unexpectedly, she blinked. "What are you saying?" I sipped my coffee and shrugged. I've made the decision to reconsider my expenditures. I believe it's time for me to give my personal objectives and savings greater attention. An uneasy pause ensued, but she laughed and waved it away. "Come on, it's only a day at the spa. We are able to pay for it." Perhaps I responded in a firm voice, "But I'm changing a few things." She stopped laughing and gave me a questioning look. I didn't go into detail, though. The shift started at that point. I progressively withdrew over the next few days. I stopped taking on extra job shifts. I quit mindlessly paying all of my bills on autopilot. Instead of complaining, I just changed how I behaved. I said casually, "I don't think that's in my budget right now," in response to her inquiry about a weekend getaway she wanted to reserve. She laughed. "Your spending plan? This is the first time you've ever spoken in such a manner. What's happening?" I calmly and steadily addressed her stare. I came to the realization that I had neglected to put myself first since I was so preoccupied about providing. That is evolving. For the first time, a flicker of hesitation, perhaps even dread, crossed her face. She wasn't sure how to deal with the structure that she had taken for granted, starting to change underfoot. She initially pretended that nothing had changed, thinking this was a passing phase. However, reality crept in as the days became weeks. Without my automatic financial assistance, the spa days, spontaneous shopping trips, and carefree indulgences began to fade. I wasn't waiting for her to apologize for what she said that evening, and she still hadn't. This was about balance, not retaliation, and I felt like I was finally getting mine back for the first time in years. Emily pretended that nothing had changed at first. She continued to fill online shopping carts, schedule her regular beauty appointments, and presume that our way of life would carry on as usual. But when the credit card bills came in, and I wasn't the one paying them, the holes in her delusions became apparent. One evening, she stood in our bedroom doorway and said, "We declined the card today." There was bewilderment, perhaps even annoyance in her voice. "I was reading a book, and I seldom looked up. That's odd," she repeated. "Yeah, strange." While she awaited my answer, she moved deeper into the room, but I did not follow suit. "Did you overlook making the payment?" I flipped through the pages. No. This month, I simply didn't feel the need to pay for pointless costs. Between us, the quiet became deeper. "Superfluous costs?" Her tone sharpened as she repeated. At last, I looked her in the eye. "The endless subscriptions, the designer handbags, and the spa days are no longer my top priorities." She squinted. "Since when?" "Since I understood that you only saw me as a wallet." She opened her mouth, then shut it again. I observed the thoughts swirling in her mind. Perhaps for the first time, she was beginning to understand that my support had never been provided without conditions, that it was not a limitless resource, and that it could be taken away just as readily as it had been offered. It slowly unraveled over the next 2 weeks. One by one, the comforts she had taken for granted started to disappear. Instead of getting takeout, she had to start cooking. Before buying anything, she had to look at the price tags. What happened to the vehicle she used for her errands? All of a sudden, she had to help keep it maintained. Then the arguments began. Although they weren't yet noisy, they were tense. One evening, while we were sitting in the dim light of the living room, she murmured, "I don't understand why you're acting like this. You used to handle everything. Why make the change now? Because I believed I was valued before. I know better now." She folded her arms. "So this is a penalty of some sort?" I took a quick breath. "No, we have made the necessary correction." She appeared truly concerned for the first time, not only irritated or inconvenienced, concerned. And perhaps, just perhaps, she was beginning to get it. However, comprehension was insufficient. Would she change? That was the true question. There was no denying the change. At first, she made an effort to dismiss it as a passing mood or stage that I would eventually outgrow. However, as the days stretched into weeks, I remained steadfast. She had begun to feel the weight of reality, and I was no longer the unquestioned provider. She initially used deceptive tactics. When she saw an online shopping cart, she would sigh deeply and gaze at me as though she thought I would give in. In a barely disguised attempt to get me to return to my former routine, she began to talk about how hectic her days were and how she just needed a little relaxation. I wasn't biting, though. I just nodded, said a few non-judgmental words of encouragement, and went about my life. She then attempted to negotiate. One evening at dinner, she twirled her fork in her noodles and said, "If you start taking care of the bills again, I'll cut down on shopping." Her eyes were alert, yet her tone was light. I sipped my beverage. I believe that having both of us active in the finances is beneficial. In this manner, we both know how much we're spending. She made a small line with her lips. It's just that taking care of it has always made things easier. Who finds it easier? Calmly, I asked. For that, she had no answer. She eventually came to understand that my transformation was irreversible. Frustration followed that discovery. She lost her temper over little things like the fact that I no longer hurried to fix things around the house, organized fancy date nights, or catered to her every whim. One evening, she crossed her arms and accused him of being petty. "I'm being reasonable," I clarified. "I made sure you never had to worry about anything for years. I believe it's time for you to experience what that was like for me." The panic struck at that moment. She began to assume greater responsibility, but not because she felt it was fair. Fearful. She feared the consequences of losing authority over me. She started cooking more, monitored her bills, and made an effort to maintain order. However, it was insufficient. It isn't possible. She wasn't acting with respect or affection. She was acting in this way because she was desperate to get her bearings after sensing that the earth underneath her was changing. And I observed with a silent confidence, not with rage or joy. The roles had shifted. Whether she would change or just be angry at me for not playing my role in her ideal world was the only question that remained. Our home was so tense that it was intolerable. It felt like we were two strangers playing house because of the reserved looks, the formal chats, and the forced politeness. I could see Emily was upset by the change, even though she had ceased directly requesting money from me. She finally lost it one evening as I was reading in the living room. She said, "I don't understand," in a voice that was a mix of desperation and frustration. "What are you doing? Why do you act as though we are adversaries?" I put down my book and gave her a serious look. I said, "I'm not your enemy. I simply stopped acting out the part you gave me." She folded her arms and scoffed. "You're giving the impression that there is a conspiracy here. I've always wished for everything to proceed smoothly." "No," I clarified, using a calm yet firm tone. "You desired everything to proceed smoothly. You never thought about how much it was costing me." Her face wavered. For the first time, I noticed something more akin to remorse rather than annoyance. She said, "I never asked you to suffer." I leaned back in my chair and sighed. "You didn't have to. You simply thought I would take care of everything. And I did for years. However, you ignored me as soon as I expressed how worn out I was. You suggested that instead of complaining, I should make an offer. That's when I understood. You never considered me more than a resource, not a person with boundaries." She gave a head shake. "That is unfair, isn't it?" I put up a challenge. "Tell me, would you have ever stopped expecting me to take care of everything if I hadn't changed?" Quiet. Suffocating quiet, heavy. She had no defense for the first time. She responded without haste. "It's impossible to manipulate. It was a delayed and painful discovery. Perhaps she wasn't mean. Perhaps she wasn't manipulative as story villains are. Perhaps she had just been self-centered in a way she had never realized until now." She took a deep breath. "I'm not sure." As though that response was sufficient, I nodded. Perhaps it was. I wasn't waiting for her to change for the first time. If she did, I was debating if I even cared. For days, the impact of our conversation hung heavy in the air. She was more reserved and thoughtful, as though she was at last facing the reality that she had resisted. I observed how she paused before speaking, and how her gaze flitted to me as if seeking some indication that things would get back to normal. However, I had come to terms with the fact that they would never. She eventually spoke one evening as I was getting ready to head to the gym. "Can we have a conversation?" She spoke in a softer tone than I had heard in a while. Slinging my backpack over my shoulder, I stopped. "I'm paying attention." As she swallowed, she fidgeted with her shirt hem. "I was mistaken. I was mistaken about almost everything, including your treatment." "Regarding my treatment of you." She took a trembling breath. "About how much I expected without giving anything back. I may have already lost you, but I don't want to." Her remark should have moved me, but instead I felt oddly unmoved. I had waited so long for an acknowledgement that I no longer required, not because I didn't care. What was different? With a steady tone, I inquired. "I began to consider what life may be like without you in it." She let out a breath. "If I had to do it all alone." And I was afraid of it. I shook my head and moaned. "Emily, that's the issue. You don't fear losing me. You're worried about losing the solace I gave you." Her gaze expanded. "That isn't it?" I cut you off. "You didn't actually see me. And now that you may have to handle things alone, you see my value all of a sudden." She said nothing. And I learned all I needed to know from that stillness. I had already decided what to do. At last I answered, "I don't want an apology that comes from fear. I desired respect. And I'm not sure I can trust it now. If you couldn't provide it when I needed it most." Her breath caught. "That's it then? Are we finished?" Since I honestly didn't know, I didn't respond straight away. I said, "I need time, and I believe you do as well." Knowing that whatever happened next would be on my terms, I walked out without saying another word. Weeks passed, and during that time I relished the silence. No longer bound by expectations that had sapped my energy, I concentrated on rebuilding and finding the person I was before I was reduced to a provider. I returned to friends I had neglected over the years, invested in activities I had long neglected, and spent more time at the gym, making choices that only benefited me and not feeling obligated to maintain a position I no longer believed in was liberating. Emily made many attempts to get in touch, a phone call here, a text there. Her tone was more muted, and her phrases were quieter each time. I wasn't in a rush to answer, though. I needed time to determine whether her adjustment was genuine or just the guise of regret disguised by her fear of losing comfort. Weeks after our last talk, she knocked on my door one evening. Uncertain of what would be inside, I hesitated before opening it. She stood there looking different when I did, not in appearance but in the way she conducted herself. She appeared less arrogant and more vulnerable, more susceptible. She put her hands together and said, "I've been thinking a lot, almost everything. This pertains to the carelessness I displayed towards you. I regret how unjust I was to you, and I no longer wish to be that individual." I looked at her for a while. What if you are unable to change? What if guilt is the only thing that speaks? She gave a quick exhale. Then I'll show you that it's not. However, I don't assume you'll believe me. I just want to give it a chance. And I'll understand if you don't want that. She wasn't demanding for once. She didn't think I would revert to my old habits. That was the primary reason I hesitated. Perhaps she had really come to a realization. Perhaps she hadn't. The difference now, though, was that I was aware of my value. I was aware of what I was and wasn't willing to tolerate. I moved aside, keeping the door slightly open. Let's have a discussion first. No assurances. Just be honest. With a nod, she entered. And suddenly, a new beginning began. One that was determined by choice, rather than duty or expectation. We had never had a conversation like that one before. It was devoid of defensiveness and accusations. Who was right or wrong wasn't the point. It was honest, unvarnished, and achingly essential. Emily sat at the kitchen table across from me, her hands clenched together, her eyes seeking mine for something, perhaps forgiveness, or at least a ray of hope. She said in a shaky voice, "I didn't realize how much I was taking from you. You, not just cash or time. Your enthusiasm, your tolerance, and your generosity are truly remarkable. I thought it was destiny. It wasn't until it was gone that I realized how much it cost you." I gave her a nod so she could continue. As much as I wanted to hear it, she needed to say it. She went on, "I have been thinking a lot about how I perceived you and how I treated you. And I regret that I didn't realize how foolish I was until I lost you. I no longer wish to be that individual. For myself, and, if there is still an us, for us, I want to improve." Her remarks were full of meaning and hovered in the air. I inhaled deeply while carefully selecting my words. "Thank you for stating this, Emily. However, this goes beyond simply recognizing what you've lost. It's important to comprehend the reasons behind its initial loss. I continued to provide because I didn't want to harm you. I was in pain, so I did it. And I prioritized myself for the first time. I'm not willing to give up on that again." With tears in her eyes, she nodded. "I get that. Furthermore, I don't expect you to suddenly trust me once more. I am aware that I must earn that. But I'd want to give it a shot. I want to demonstrate to you that I am capable of being different, that I can view you as more than simply a supplier, and that I can be a partner rather than a taker." I studied her, leaning back in my chair. She had never before recognized the inequality in our connection until now. It was the first time she had ever accepted responsibility for her role. It was also a beginning, even though it didn't end the years of bitterness I had harbored. "At long last," I answered. "I'm willing to try. However, it won't be simple. We cannot restore the status quo." "I refuse to allow that to occur. I would prefer that they not," she replied hastily. "I don't wish to return to that. I'm looking for something more genuine, something better." So we started over. We started the process carefully, slowly, with plenty of talking and even more patience. Emily began assuming greater responsibility on her own initiative. Not because I urged her to. She took a part-time job to help support us financially. Instead of getting takeout, she began preparing her own meals. She even expressed regret to me for all the time she had taken me for granted, not just for what she had said that evening. It wasn't flawless. There were tense times when old routines seemed likely to return. However, for the first time, we were cooperating rather than opposing one another. For my part, I kept putting myself first. I maintained my friendships, my workout routine, and my hobbies. I refrained from reverting to the role of the uncritical supplier. And gradually, I started to feel like myself once more, not simply a spouse or a provider, but a person with needs, goals, and value of my own. A year has passed since that night, and although we are still working on our relationship, it is stronger than it has ever been. Emily and I are coming to view one another as partners and equals. And I'm feeling optimistic about the future for the first time in a long time, not just for us, but also for myself. If all of this has taught me anything, it's that love shouldn't come at the expense of your identity. And if it does, it's sacrifice rather than love. Furthermore, nobody ought to have to live that way.